In the middle of the Second World War, while entire armies trembled before Hitler, the boldest resistance against the Nazi regime did not come from a general or a spy. It came from a 21-year-old student. I'm talking about Sophie Scholl, a young woman who, at the height of Nazi power, walked through the corridors of her own university carrying a suitcase full of banned leaflets, knowing exactly what would happen if she were discovered. Even so, she kept going. She threw hundreds of leaflets from the top of a staircase, sending messages against Adolf Hitler flying through the air right under the regime's nose. Her end was tragic, but she died a heroine, and her story is so powerful that it was turned into a film. In today's video, I'm going to tell you everything about Sophie Scholl, a young woman who, in the darkest moment of modern history, chose hope when everyone else chose fear. Stay until the end, because what they did to her in the end is enough to make you furious. Who was Sophie? Sophie Scholl was born in May of 1921 in the small town of Vorarlberg in southern Germany. She grew up during an extremely turbulent period in German history. The country still bore the scars of its defeat in the First World War, faced constant economic crises, and lived in a climate of political instability that would open the way for the rise of extremism. Many Germans were desperate. Unemployment, inflation, hunger, and national humiliation had become part of everyday life. It was in this setting that Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party began to win more and more popular support, promising to restore Germany's pride and rebuild the country. But inside the Scholl family home, the message was different. Her father, Robert Scholl, was a mayor and an outspoken critic of Nazism, something extremely dangerous in that country at that time. While much of the population was beginning to support Hitler, Robert warned his children about the dangers of political fanaticism and blind obedience to the state. He believed that no ideology should matter more than human conscience. Those ideas would deeply shape Sophie, even if she did not yet realize it at the time. She grew up in a Lutheran family, was a dedicated student, and developed a strong interest in art, music, and literature from an early age. She liked to draw, read often, and took an interest in authors who would later be banned by the Nazi regime. Friends from that time described Sophie as kind, intelligent, and deeply reflective. She had a sensitive personality, but she was also determined. She was the kind of person who observed a great deal before speaking. But like millions of young Germans in the 1930s, Sophie was also drawn in by the collective enthusiasm surrounding the rise of the Nazi regime. In those years, Nazism did not present itself to young people merely as a political movement. It presented itself as hope, as belonging, as the future. At the age of 12, Sophie joined the League of German Girls, the female branch of the Hitler Youth. And at that moment, it all seemed completely normal. There were outdoor activities, sports, trips, songs, camps, and a strong sense of unity among the young. The regime understood perfectly how to win over adolescents, making them feel that they were taking part in the construction of a new Germany, strong, disciplined, and proud. At first, Sophie was enthusiastic. Her brother Hansa also took part in the movement and was even seen as a possible future leader within the organization. Like many young people of that generation, the two believed they were witnessing the birth of a better country. But that enthusiasm would not last forever. Sophie began to notice something unsettling behind that facade of order and patriotism. Books were banned, teachers disappeared, people were arrested for their opinions, and any kind of dissent was starting to be treated as a threat to the state. Little by little, she began to understand that the regime did not want only to control Germany's politics. It also wanted to control the way people thought, spoke, and even dreamed. And it was at that moment that something began to change inside her. Hitler's rise. Germany in the 1930s and 40s was not a free country. It was a country ruled by fear. After Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, the Nazi regime began turning Germany into a totalitarian state, and that transformation happened quickly. Little by little, freedoms disappeared, political parties were banned, independent newspapers were shut down, and books considered dangerous began to be burned in public squares before crowds of people. Teachers lost their positions, artists were censored, and anyone considered a threat to the regime began to disappear. Disagreeing with Nazism was no longer just a political opinion. It became a threat to one's very survival. The Gestapo, the regime's secret police, spread fear throughout Germany. People were arrested without warning, often in the middle of the night. In some cases, entire families vanished without a trace. Neighbors informed on neighbors, colleagues informed on colleagues, even children were encouraged to report their own parents if they heard criticism of the government at home. The regime wanted to control everything. The press was tightly controlled, universities were watched, churches were pressured, conversations were monitored. And little by little, fear spread through everyday life in an almost invisible way. People learned to measure their words, learned to look around before speaking, learned to distrust one another. In Nazi Germany, even silence had become a form of survival. Anyone who thought differently basically had three options: stay silent, flee, or resist and risk absolutely everything. And resisting did not just mean risking arrest, it meant risking your job, your family, your freedom, and often your very life. That is why most people chose silence, not necessarily because they supported Hitler, but because fear could paralyze even those who, deep down, knew that something was wrong. That was exactly how totalitarian regimes survived, by making fear seem stronger than conscience. But Sophie Scholl chose something different. The path Sophie took. At 16, Sophie was arrested for the first time. At that moment, she was still very young, but she was already beginning to see the contradictions in the regime she had once admired. The image of a strong, united, patriotic Germany was beginning to give way to something much darker. Her brother Hans had been discovered taking part in one of the youth movements opposed to the Hitler Youth, groups made up of young people who rejected the absolute control Nazism was trying to impose on the lives and thoughts of Germany's younger generation. These groups emerged as small forms of resistance amid the regime's growing repression. Many young people refused to accept that the state should decide what they could hear, read, think, or even feel. Some met in secret to listen to banned music, others read authors censored by the government, and in some cases, they even physically confronted members of Nazi organizations. For the regime, any sign of independence was already considered dangerous. When the police arrived at the Scholl family home, Sophie and her other siblings were also detained. The raid on the house made it clear that no one was truly safe, not even ordinary families. For Sophie, the detention lasted only a few hours, but Hans remained imprisoned for 3 weeks, being interrogated by the Nazi authorities. Even without receiving a long sentence, the experience left deep marks on her. For the first time, the regime's repression had crossed beyond newspapers, radio, and political speeches. It had entered the Scholl family home itself. Fear was no longer something distant. Persecution was no longer just a news item, and Nazism no longer seemed like merely an authoritarian government. It changed Sophie. From that point on, indifference was no longer an option for her. In 1940, Sophie finished high school and began working as a kindergarten teacher, partly to try to avoid the compulsory national labor service imposed by the Nazi regime. In Hitler's Germany, young people were constantly being steered towards serving the state. The government wanted to control not only politics, but also education, work, and even the way people thought. The idea was simple. The individual was meant to exist only to serve Nazi Germany. Massoff was increasingly moving away from that view. Sometime later, she enrolled at the University of Munich to study philosophy and biology. It was there that she reunited with her brother Hans, who was studying medicine. And it was in that university environment that her view of the world changed forever. Despite the heavy Nazi surveillance, universities were still among the few places where some intellectual discussions could survive. Many professors had already been expelled or silenced, but small discussion circles continued to exist quietly. In Munich, Zoff came into contact with writers, artists, professors, and thinkers who criticized the regime in conversations that were almost always whispered, far from the eyes of the Gestapo. She began reading more and more, questioning more and more, and realizing that the Nazi regime survived not only through violence, but also through the silence of ordinary people. Christian authors, philosophers, and accounts of the crimes committed by Germany during the war began to affect her deeply. Little by little, her rejection of Nazism became impossible to hide, even from herself. And it was also in Munich that Zoff found the group that would change her life and end it. The White Rose. What was the White Rose? The White Rose was a small group of university students who decided to do what almost no one in Nazi Germany still had the courage to do: to speak the truth out loud, not with weapons, not with violence, but with words. While millions of people remained silent out of fear or pretended not to see what was happening around them, those young people believed there was still a moral responsibility to resist, even knowing it could cost them their lives. The group was made up mainly of students from the University of Munich. Among them were Hans Scholl, Alexander Schmorell, Christoph Probst, Willy Graf, and Professor Kurt Huber. Ordinary young people, many of them religious, passionate readers of philosophy, literature, and history. But there was something that united them above all else: the conviction that remaining silent in the face of Nazism was also a form of complicity. They secretly produced pamphlets, philosophical texts, moral reflections, biblical quotations, and direct criticism of Hitler's regime. They wrote at night, printed in hiding, and then distributed the material throughout Munich and other German cities. They placed the pamphlets in telephone booths, mailed them to doctors, professors, and intellectuals, left them on university benches, and scattered them through the corridors of academic buildings. Everything had to be done with extreme care. If they were discovered by the Gestapo, the charge would be clear: treason. And in Nazi Germany, treason almost always meant death. The White Rose's message was direct: Nazism is a crime against humanity. Resist. The group's activities began in June of 1942. The first 4 leaflets were written mainly by Hans Scholl and Alexander Schmorell, inspired both by their Christian faith and by news of the atrocities committed by the regime in the Frauenreal. At that point, Zoff was still observing more than participating, but that would not last much longer. She wanted to do more. She wanted to write. She wanted to print. She wanted to distribute the leaflets herself. And she knew that, as a woman, she usually drew less suspicion from the Gestapo than the men in the group. That allowed her to transport materials and move around with less attention from the authorities. So Zoff made her decision. She joined the White Rose. Before we continue, if you've made it this far, you're probably the kind of person who truly values history. Am I right? So if you haven't subscribed yet, click below now. Every subscription helps us keep producing content like this. I'd also ask you to leave a like and turn on notifications. It's quick for you, but it makes a huge difference to our work and helps this kind of content reach more people. And feel free to leave a comment as well. You can suggest topics, talk about today's video, or simply write, "I want more stories." And now let us return to that February of 1943. The beginning of the end. It was the 18th of February, 1943. The war was already beginning to turn against Germany. A few days earlier, the Nazi army had suffered a devastating defeat at Stalingrad, and the regime's sense of invincibility was slowly beginning to crumble. It was that morning that Zoff and Hanshaw arrived at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, carrying a suitcase full of White Rose leaflets. It was the group's 6th leaflet, the boldest so far. In it, the students denounced the crimes of the Nazi regime and called on the German people to resist before the country was completely destroyed by war and tyranny. The two began distributing the leaflets through the university corridors, leaving copies near classrooms, on benches, and under doors. Everything had to be done quickly. Classes were about to begin, and at any moment, someone could have realized what they were doing. But just as they were getting ready to leave, Sophie made an impulsive decision, one that would change everything. At the top of the staircase in the main building, she noticed there was still a stack of leaflets left in the suitcase. Then, in a sudden move, she stepped up to the stair railing and pushed the papers down to the floor below. The leaflets floated through the air, white and light, slowly spinning as they fell over the students in the university lobby. For a moment, it looked almost like a poetic scene, silent, almost beautiful. And that would be the last free gesture of Sophie Scholl's life. The problem was that someone saw everything. The university custodian, Jakob Schmie, a loyal supporter of the Nazi regime, witnessed the scene. He immediately ran to block the building's exits and alerted the Gestapo. Sophie and Hans tried to stay calm, but it was already too late. The two of them were arrested inside the university that very same day, and from that moment on, there was practically no way back. Interrogations and the trial. After the arrest, Sophie tried to protect the other members of the White Rose as much as she could. During the interrogations, she avoided naming names and tried to convince the investigators that the action had been limited to her and her brother alone, but the situation quickly became more complicated. When Hans was searched, the agents found a draft leaflet written by Christophist, another member of the group. From that point on, the Gestapo realized it was not dealing with just two students acting on their own. Under the constant pressure of the interrogations, Hans eventually confessed his involvement with the White Rose. Then Sophie made her decision. She took full responsibility for the actions of the two of them, even knowing exactly what that meant. 4 days later, on the 22nd of February 1943, Sophie Scholl was taken before the People's Court in Munich. Despite its name, that Nazi court did not exist to deliver justice. It existed to condemn enemies of the regime. Trials were swift, humiliating, and practically decided before they even began. Lawyers had little influence, witnesses barely mattered, and acquittals were extremely rare. Presiding over the case was Roland Freisler, one of the most feared judges in Nazi Germany. Freisler was known for turning trials into spectacles of intimidation. He shouted at the accused, interrupted their statements, insulted them publicly, and tried to destroy psychologically anyone who appeared before him. Many defendants could barely speak, but Sophie did. Even in front of a court created to crush her, she remained calm and at one point declared, "Someone had to make a start. What we wrote and said is believed by many others. They just do not have the courage to express themselves as we did." That was not the statement of someone trying to escape death. It was the statement of someone who had already accepted the consequences of what she had done. The trial lasted only a few hours. At the end of the session, Sophie Scholl, Hans Scholl, and Christoph Probst were found guilty of high treason. The sentence was death. And in Nazi Germany in 1943, death usually did not wait. The execution would be carried out that very same day. Sophie. A few hours before the execution, Sophie Scholl was visited by her parents at Stenheim prison. The meeting was brief. The guards watched everything closely, and everyone there knew this would be their last goodbye. Even so, witnesses reported that Sophie remained incredibly calm. She did not panic, and she did not beg for mercy. Somehow, she seemed more concerned with comforting her own parents than with mourning the fate that awaited her. Her mother, deeply religious, tried to give her strength in those final minutes. She said, "Remember Jesus." Sophie replied calmly, "Yes, but you as well." It was a simple exchange of words, but one filled with meaning. Even in the face of death, Sophie seemed determined not to show fear. At one point, one of the guards offered her a cigarette. Sophie smoked. Even so, she accepted the gesture, perhaps not because of the cigarette itself, but because in that cold and brutal place, it represented a rare moment of humanity. She remained serene until the end, And that serenity caused discomfort even among those who worked for the Nazi system. There was something unsettling about seeing a 21-year-old young woman walk to her death with more dignity than many of the men who condemned her. Neither the guards nor the prison staff, nor the men accustomed to dealing with executions every day could fully understand that calm. At 5 in the afternoon, on the 22nd of February 1943, Sophie was led to the execution chamber at Standenheim prison in Munich. Everything happened with bureaucratic speed, coldly and mechanically, as if the Nazi state were simply carrying out one more routine task. In the room were official representatives of the regime, the Reich prosecutor, a government official, the prison director, and the prison doctor responsible for confirming the death. 2 guards escorted Sophie through the prison corridors to the execution room. She was only 21 years old. Her identity was formally confirmed. Shortly afterward, she was handed over to the executioner, Johann Harthardt. Harthardt was not an inexperienced man, quite the opposite. He had executed hundreds of people under the Nazi regime and knew every detail of that brutal procedure. But that execution would be different from the others. Sophie was placed before the guillotine. Her hands were bound. Her body was secured to the wooden board, which was then slid beneath the blade. Even at that final moment, witnesses said she remained calm. No scream, no plea for mercy, no despair. Then Johann Harthardt activated the mechanism. The blade fell, and within a few seconds, it was all over. Prison records state that only 6 seconds passed between the moment Sophie was placed in the guillotine and her death. 48 seconds after leaving her cell, she had already been officially declared dead. That was how the Nazi regime eliminated its enemies, with speed, silence, and calculated efficiency. But even men accustomed to death did not leave that execution unmoved. Years later, Johann Harthardt, responsible for hundreds of executions, would say that he had never seen anyone face death with as much courage as Sophie. Sophie was only 21 years old. She did not command armies, hold positions of power, or lead an armed revolution. She had no soldiers, no political influence, no protection, only words, and the conviction that remaining silent in the face of injustice was also a way of taking part in it. In a country where millions of people had learned to obey out of fear, Sophie chose to act even knowing exactly the price she might pay, and she paid it. But what the Nazi regime could not destroy was the meaning of what she represented. With the end of the war, the story of the White Rose became known throughout Germany. The leaflets produced by the group survived the Third Reich. Their words endured through time. Today, Sophie Scholl is remembered as one of the greatest symbols of moral resistance of the 20th century. In Germany, schools, streets, and squares bear her name. Books, films, and documentaries have portrayed her life over the decades. And the story of the White Rose came to be studied in different parts of the world as proof that even ordinary people can challenge systems built on fear and violence. Because it is easy to imagine courage when you are safe. What is difficult is holding on to your principles when doing the right thing can destroy your life. Perhaps that is exactly what makes Sophie's story so unsettling even today. It forces us to face a question many people prefer to avoid. What does an ordinary person do when they realize that the world around them is wrong? Because in times of oppression, the real question is not, what will the government do? The question is, what am I going to do? If this story touched you in any way, leave a comment below. What do you think gave a 21-year-old young woman the courage to face a regime like that? And if you enjoy real and interesting stories like this one, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next videos, okay? See you next time.